I'm here with Stephen Vertigans, and you are a part of the Norbert Elias network. You're a regular participant at the conferences. I must confess, we haven't talked so far in person. We have just seen each other and we have shaken our hands, but that's it. So I'm curious, what are you about in Norbert Elias? What is your personal reference to Norbert Elias?
Personal reference in terms of what introduced me to the work of Norbert Elias.
Mm-hmm.
That would go back to the first sociology lecture I ever attended as a undergraduate student, and I was studying sociology and economics at that point as joint honours. The economics lectures I'd attended had already bored me immensely, and so in the first week I went with some trepidation to the sociology lecture, having already been somewhat disillusioned with economics.
Yeah.
And the lecturer was Richard Kilminster, who is a very esteemed member of the Elias group.
Yeah.
And I was blown away by the manner in which Richard approached very complicated issues in a way that made complete sense. And from that point onwards, I very much enjoyed those lectures. I found them very stimulating, and it was sufficient for me to change to single honours sociology by week 2.
Okay.
And my interest grew from that point onwards.
So you graduated then in sociology, and you dropped economics, and this was at the University of Leeds, where you see it, Richard. So you studied in Leeds, and then you proceeded in this direction. You became an assistant at the University of Leeds, or what was your further academic career?
I had a diverse career. In sociology as a discipline can offer a variety of different options in terms of careers, and which is something I tell my own students in terms of how sociology and Elisian Insights can prepare you for a variety of different tasks, right, different jobs. Yeah. And for 2 years I was I had a management job, management trainee as they were then called, and then a management job, and realised very quickly that the reverse of the situation with Richard. I realised as soon as the induction week started that I really didn't want to do this job for the rest of my life. I wanted to become return to university. Cool. And it was a case of preparing funding proposals, identifying the subject that I wanted to study, and ultimately I had to save some money because I became self-funded because the grant situation was all the funding for scholarships was very limited, so I wasn't awarded a scholarship, and I was adamant that I wanted to return. I couldn't see myself enduring 40 years in roles that I didn't find particularly rewarding or pleasing in any shape or form. So I returned to do a PhD at the University of Leeds.
And you were self-funding from different. I think it must have been a complicated time. As far as I know, Baumann was there, and he was not very Eliasian, to say it in a decent way. How was the institutional situation? You were part of a minority group, or how was it arranged at the University of Leeds I think in the 1990s? What we are talking about.
1990 was when Baumann retired.
Ah, okay.
So he retired in my final year as an undergraduate. 1992, the university, or the school as it then was, went in a very different direction in that there was strong emphasis on women's studies. So there were a variety of different schools of thought within the school. Yeah. Richard had obvious expertise and kind of a global figure within the Eliasian network. There were members of staff who were perhaps sympathetic to Elias without being full advocates of Elias. Okay.
And you were then very soon coming to the Norbert Elias circles and to this kind of conferences, I think.
Not initially, no. Yeah. I think partly because I was self-funded. Okay. And my situation was, I started off initially undertaking some tutorial work to bring some money, and Richard was one of the lecturers who I worked for. Okay. So I started from a relatively early phase as a postgraduate student, teaching students through seminars, through tutorials, Richard lectures or interpreted them for him. So that was a very useful way for me to get more closer to how Richard actually thought through a number of these issues. And although not every lecture would be explicitly Eliasian, clearly there was consistency in the way that he approached the whole scale of issues that were raised during that particular course.
Okay. So you had a lot of students which went in a different direction also, and you also supervised them. There was diversity. It was not that you said in Leeds you have to do Eliasian research when you want to write your bachelor thesis. That didn't happen.
No, there was none of that instruction. What you would tend to find would be the better lecturers were inundated with requests for members of staff to be their supervisors, and if you wanted that person to supervise you and you knew they would have a selection to choose, you had more chance if you tailored your proposal to the interests of the lecture in question.
So this was a demand problem because there were less possibilities to write a bachelor thesis, and and so you had to find a topic which was to the liking of the professor.
Yes.
To be accepted.
Yes, and my supervisor was not Richard for my undergraduate dissertation. It was Ian Barco, who is more Weberian, but he has sympathies to Elias, and certainly has a broader theoretical insight or insights. Yeah. So he was a very useful supervisor, and I've always been interested in groups who are then outsiders, or movements who are then outsiders, both from a societal perspective or a global perspective, but also from a sociological perspective. And my focus was very much about the ways in which sociology was unable to explain, or certainly mainstream sociology, as you would perhaps call it, unable to explain phenomena that didn't fit within the paradigms of that particular period. And one of the areas that particularly interested me, or dismayed me to a degree, was that there's still a dominance in the late 1980s of the secularization thesis. And this very Eurocentric perspective that religion will die, religion was on the wane, this kind of continuing influence of the kind of classical fathers, that religion would be replaced, and all the evidence was suggesting that in other parts of the world that simply was not happening. My interest really stemmed from there, initially looking at Iran, Iranian Revolution, both to tease out the religious component, but also the reverse was happening, that people were looking at the Iranian Revolution as being overwhelmingly religious, so they looked at the outcome, and the outcome determined people's understanding of the preceding processes. And because it became very notionally Islamic, that was what they thought was the cause. But you actually look at the incredible group of collaborators who led to the Iranian Revolution, both in terms of secular and also religious, whole variety of left-wing, right-wing groups, feminists opposed alongside the mullahs. It's a very complex array of interdependencies within that particular movement, and that really led to a range of interests around what challenges a lot of sociology and how sociology is unable to explain. And that point then led to more understanding of the way in which Eliasian concepts and Eliasian framework can help to understand behaviour that Elias himself may not have explicitly referred to. So it's about looking at more innovative ways of adaptation.
Wow, very cool. Very interesting, especially about Iran. I don't know, you got empirical material from there? How did you evolve your theory? Just from newspapers? What were your sources for preparing such an enormous work on this topic?
It was principally literature-based. There was a lot within the media. Clearly the media then was a very different beast to what the media is today. There was a lot of media coverage, even though it was, by that point it was kind of 10 years plus beyond that point. But there's also a fair amount of literature covering the revolution, but they were often doing it from a political perspective, international relations, a religious perspective. There was very few, I'm struggling to think of any, insightful sociological contributions. And that kind of opened up possibilities to me.
Okay. Very cool. And you say the media were not the same at this time. I myself, I was graduating way past 2000, so I had already the internet. I had all the possibilities to see videos on YouTube, and I could Google something. And I think you were preparing in the 1990s. The internet was not a tool you were using. You were just I don't think you had any special magazines. You were going to newspapers you could receive, or what are the sources? Or you were recalling BBC? I don't know. What did you do?
For the undergraduate,
yeah,
it was 10,000 words. So
okay.
the extent of the research was not particularly detailed,
okay.
and what was a very rudimentary attempt at innovation was partly about the ways in which I used the existing knowledge and interpreted that knowledge, which was the basis for my claim of originality. Where I then went to master, or when I then returned to do my PhD,
yeah.
I was initially going to extend my undergraduate dissertation, and I was going to focus on the groups who became outsiders post-revolution.
Yeah.
So the Iranian secularists who'd been written out of history by this point, and I wanted to understand their motivations, the reasons why they became involved, the process that led to their involvement, and also why they made the deal with the mullahs and they lost the deal.
Yeah.
So to try and understand more about that process and how they became marginalised so soon after the revolution ended, and why they were perhaps unable to foresee that this was a very distinct possibility when so many of the views within that coalition were contradictory.
I think it's something very typical for revolutions. We have this in the French Revolution, which is, of course, the most famous, where then they beheaded their own people, like Danton and so on, and very important revolutionary leaders. And today's election, we have this with the Russian Revolution, where Stalin was eliminating all his rivals. And you observe the same with the Iran, where they actually, I don't know, beheading, but they were fighting against, and you say there were feminists also involved into this against the Shah, and I think it's a very typical.
Yeah, one of my intentions was to do a comparison across different revolutions. Yeah. Because again, people perceive the Iranian Revolution to be very, very distinctive. Yeah. No one had actually systematically compared other forms of revolution to see just because the outcome is different, does that mean the preceding processes were very different? Yeah. And that was something I was wanting to look at. Picking up on your point about field work, ostensibly, I was intending to focus on exiles. Yeah. I realised very quickly that although it would not be essential to visit Iran, then I still wanted to do that. The more I read, the more I wanted to visit, the more fascinated I became. There were practical issues around that time surrounding Western students, Western academics, to visit Iran. Even if you weren't actually going to take field work, it would still be viewed with some consternation. And there was also, I like to go, and if I go to a place, to wander around, to kind of go away off the beaten track. I can't stop asking people questions, for good or ill, and I suspected, and I was perhaps advised, that may not be a wise approach. Okay. So I reluctantly decided quite early in the process to change subjects, or change countries to be more precise. Okay. I was still fascinated by the Islamic element, and I was still fascinated by the outsider component within that. But I wanted to go to a country that was more accessible, that I could visit with relative ease. And Turkey was neighbouring Iran, different form of Islamic interpretation, but there's some similarities. And what again surprised me about Turkey, and again it was quite a challenge sociologically, was there's still this notion of this kind of almost cliche about East meets West, and yet this notion had been that East meets West would mean that the West would win. You know, that Turkey would become more westernised, the eastern side would become marginalised. Yeah. But there were already indications in early 1990s that Turkey was not actually becoming more secular. Yeah. Though significant pockets were, who the media would focus on, who tourists would focus on, come away with this impression of Turkey. But when you actually looked at Anatolia, then there was a growing sense of religious conservatism.
Well, nowadays Turkey is moving a little bit far away from the West. I think 4 years ago, they were even thinking about putting Turkey in the European Union, and this was considered a serious approach by some politicians. And nowadays, they are going away from European Union, well, like the British as well, but you know what I'm saying. It's reversed somehow. It's a backlash in some kind, what they experience nowadays.
Yep. And although I would not say, I wouldn't necessarily predict it precisely what's unfolded, it was apparent when I was looking in the kind of mid-1990s that Islam was being used, as it was subsequently used by Western governments. It was being used as a way of trying to mobilise political support, and the way that the parties sought to do that would be through sponsorship of religious institutions, through promoting religious curricula, through creating standards, through socialising processes that the government themselves were not keeping. That the political parties could not meet the promises they were making about religious edicts. So they were creating this very diverse, or trying to reach out to a more diverse base with contradictory policies that were unsustainable. And there was a degree of inevitability that this would contribute, as it's happened across the Middle East, contribute to greater sense of religious fervour and a greater distancing between governments who were unable to actually, they were encouraging people to hold standards and beliefs that the government were not delivering for them. So there was this increasing contradiction between what the government was saying and what they were doing. And that's not unique, clearly that happens all around the world, but it became more magnified because they were using it almost a predating model of Islam and what Islam can achieve and what it's done in the past. So you have this glorious sense of how Islamic empires, or the Ottoman Empire, underpinned loosely with the forms of Islam, how they had been so instrumental in global powers. So the supporters of religion had actually got a base in which they could say this religion works as a political ideology. And what you're telling us is not working.
It's quite interesting, and to see this, I always ask myself, but what about China? They claim to be an atheist country, which is actually not the case, because they have also Confucius very present nowadays. But they claim to be a communist country as well, and in fact they are one of the biggest capitalist countries of the world. I think they are second behind the United States now, and they will pass by the United States in the future. So it's quite interesting to see that there's an ideology which is much stronger and maintained by people than factually acting of the government. So I think it's somehow comparable as an example. I don't know, I'm not the expert on this topic, but I think it's quite interesting to see this development in different countries on different interpretations of word, that this happens all over the world.
Well, I also know very little about China, but to use other comparisons I'm more familiar with, Turkey, I think, like many other countries, and what's probably unfolding in the West to a degree, the secularists within Turkey made the mistake of ignoring the people whose beliefs they did not agree with. They, were very dismissive of traditionalists. They're very dismissive of rural populations. They were seen to be very uncivilized in that particularly normative way, and so there was a growing gap between large bulks of the population who felt unrepresented, who were feeling marginalised, and a political elite. And to a degree, Turkey was ahead of the curve in terms of what's actually starting to happen in Europe and the US, where comparable groups have also felt that sense of disenchantment, that sense of disengagement, and are turning to more radical solutions.
So let's go a step back from your research to your actually life. How was it received? How was it accepted that you did this research? Was it positively praised? Was you were lonesome, like someone who's alone in the forest and he's shouting his message to the world? What did happen to your research about Turkey and Iran? Was there any reception at this time?
It probably goes through cycles, and I have interests. Much of my interests tend to be around what I want to find out for myself. Once I find out to my own satisfaction, then I will change subjects. So I have no intention of lingering on the same subject for a bulk period. Once I'm satisfied, then I move on. Not to say I know everything about the subject, but I know enough to have satisfied my initial interest. Yeah. And so I'd gone from Iran to Turkey. I then started to look at more broader forms of Islamic movements, and from there I moved on to terror groups, some of which were notionally Islamic, but then there were a whole variety of other groups, kind of German, American, Italian, Japanese, Irish, and my interest continued to evolve. So there is at first glance they appear perhaps slightly disparate grouping, but there has been this evolution going through kind of forms of Islam, and then onto the kind of more political violent forms, and then into more extensive forms of analysis of terrorism. Okay. All of which I haven't actually answered your question yet, and I shall return now to your question. And it probably has that quite fragmented approach has meant, I suppose, I tended to leap from subjects, and it's probably been quite difficult to pin me down to a particular area of expertise, because my area kind of shifts quite relatively quickly. I have to keep applying to different forms of journals. So because there is clearly the genres within journal classifications, my publications tend to appear in a whole array of different publications. So the kind of readership is often quite diverse. And I would say probably within the Eliasian group, there was, in the early days, people were not necessarily focusing on wider horizons. There wasn't much focus on religion, for example. There wasn't much focus on countries outside the global north. And there was never resentment. That people have always been extremely welcoming. They were always supportive, but there wasn't perhaps a huge amount of interest. I know people would express, they would have conversations, but I think it was a case of almost of these people don't fit within our own belief frameworks. Therefore.
Well, I think it's very much, I don't want to badmouth, but it's very much about the British community, especially, I think, which is a very big community, and then they are very focused on their area of the world, and I think the Eliasian community in the world it's more diverse. It's looking into different countries as well. But in Britain you have a very special community of Eliasians, because you're a very big in-group, to say. And I think it's somehow nice to have many people. On the other hand, it draws a lot of attention to your own questions, and you have very close network with people with similar questions asking.
Yes, that would be, I think, a fair summary. And what is, to me, has been so pleasing over recent years has been the expansion. And you just need to, for example, look at the list of subjects for this particular conference, and it's much more diverse than preceding conferences. And there are new people with different forms of interpretation, different subject areas, who are asking some very challenging questions of what has gone on before. And I think that critical edge has often been lacking, because the network has been so supportive, which has been very, very helpful, but it has, to an extent, possibly restricted the pushing back of boundaries.
And you do field research in Africa, or do you have students which you send there? What's your current access to Africa? Okay.
At the moment, we've just finished two projects, both in the same settlement. One of which was looking at resilience within the informal settlements, trying to understand the basis through which people have these resources, human resources, these networks that they create, these figurations they create, that enables them to overcome such difficulties and do that in a way that they find pleasing and rewarding. The ways in which people are able to be very community-minded in a community that people feel proud of. Many of the neighbourhoods, Kibera is infamous within Kenya because it seemed to be very crime-ridden, dreadful poverty, huge environmental problems, and yet the people themselves are very emotionally attached to that location.
Yeah.
And so one of the projects was trying to really tease out the processes that were shaping those attachments.
Cool.
And the second project was also in Kibera, and that was looking at why Kibera has strongly often been associated with political violence.
Yeah.
So in the 2007 elections, following those heavily contested elections, there was dreadful violence across Kenya, and Kibera was one of the hotspots where that happened. And 2017, there were two elections in Kenya, two presidential elections. One took place, it was legally challenged, and they had to have a rerun. The main challenger then refused to participate, so it was a very contested period, very fraught with uncertainty, very tense for a number of people, and there was an expectation that the violence of 2008 could well return, and Kibera was one of the places where this was anticipated. Contrary to expectations, Kibera was relatively peaceful. There was some violence, but that was more between the police and opposition supporters. There wasn't the kind of widespread inter-group violence that there was in 2008. And so I was very keen to find out why that happened. So not why did violence happen, why didn't violence happen?
Okay.
And what I did with one of my colleagues, we used an approach called photo voice. So we issued the participants with mobile phones with camera facilities and asked them to take photographs of images that for them in the first instance represented resilience, and in the second case it helped to understand why there was no violence and why peace largely was maintained. And it was trying, I think, to empower the participants. And picking up on an earlier point, there is a particular danger when you're working in parts of Africa, that it is the Western academic. There is still this kind of very post-colonial power dynamic between Western academics and people within many parts of Africa. And by shifting the responsibility and sharing the research dynamics with the participants, they take more control. So all you're giving them is a very loose instruction. They then go away and take photos of whatever they choose to take, and they then come back and select which photos they want to talk about and explain why they took those photographs.
Cool.
So they were then actually providing the words, the narrative, which we were then able to analyse, identifying themes, trying to gain an understanding of the processes that they themselves have actually introduced that led to the peaceful period.